my name is Rachel Lovett. I'm the curator and assistant director at the historic Hammond-Harwood House Museum in downtown Annapolis, Maryland. While the museum is closed due to COVID-19, I'm bringing you a series of research that I'm doing. Today we're going to talk about the country house of the original owner of the Hammond-Harwood House. And it's a topic that we really haven't touched on very much in our research at the museum. And on tour, we generally tend not to talk about the original owner. And why? We'll talk about that. So the original owner of the Hammond-Harwood House was a young man named Matthias Hammond. Matthias likely never lived in the impressive residence on Maryland Avenue as his primary residence. However, he was the one who commissioned skilled British-born architect William Buckland to design the home in 1774. So, without Matthias Hammond, the story of the Hammond-Harwood House would never have happened. From records, we can ascertain that Hammond spent the majority of his life on his family's plantation in modern-day Gambrills, Maryland. The property was known as Howard's Adventure. Early Marylanders had a wonderful habit of naming their land tracts. In Anne Arundel County, early properties generally had names pertaining to the families, including examples such as Hopkins' Chance, Petticourt's Rest, and Norwood's Fancy. So the next time you're thinking about naming your house, maybe you can look to Anne Arundel land tracts for inspiration. The Howard family were early settlers in Anne Arundel County and large landowners, which included the farm known as Howard's Adventure. The property came into the Hammond family through marriage. Charles Hammond married Hannah Howard, the daughter of Captain Philip Howard, and who owned the property. The property was likely acquired after the death of Captain Howard in 1701. Charles Hammond built the manor house sometime after 1705, and it was improved upon up until about 1730. Philip Hammond, who was the father of Matthias, was the son of Charles and Hannah, so those two original Hammonds. When Charles died in 1713, his holdings were divided between his sons. Philip bought out his other brothers in entire shares so that he was the sole owner of Howard's Adventure. So that's Matthias Hammond's father. So Matthias Hammond's parents, Philip Hammond and Rachel Bryce, were married in 1728. Rachel was the daughter of Captain John Bryce and Sarah Dorsey, and her maiden name was Howard, so another Howard connection. The English-born Captain John Bryce was really one of the largest landholders in the county. He owned several plantations. He was a judge, a merchant, and of course a captain. Unfortunately, by the time of Rachel's wedding, he had passed away, so it was her older brother, John Bryce II, who gave her away at the wedding. And in this wedding, no expense was spared. It was a really lavish affair. The wedding day began in Annapolis and continued at Hammond's Manor at Howard's Adventure as the night progressed. Now, a Hammond descendant by the name of Laura Webb Peploe described the wedding in her 1922 publication, History of the Hammond Family. And she said, "After the wedding ceremony, they sit down to a great dinner. The Bryces entertained royally, and all that could be said of Annapolis society in that day was applicable to the great occasion. At 8 o'clock, the wedding party winds its way to Hammond's Manor. Philip's coach has been imported along with other things across the seas for his wedding. Arriving, they find a community assembled. The blazing fire and the twinkling of candles reflect soft light on surfaces of polished mahogany and glistening silver in the mirrors. The music begins and the dances glide gracefully. At midnight, the wedding supper is served." Now, while this event took place 132 years prior to Miss Webb Peploe's birth in 1860, we can assume that the colorful description had been passed down verbally through the generations. Philip and Rachel Hammond had 9 children. 7 survived to adulthood, including 1 girl and 6 boys. The youngest was Matthias Hammond, the original owner of the Hammond-Harwood House. Out of the 7 children, only 3 married, the 2 eldest sons and a daughter. So Matthias was really one of 4 bachelor brothers. We always or speculating why he stayed a bachelor, and we'll talk about that a little later. Now, his father, Philip, was very active in Annapolis society. He was a vestryman at St. Anne's Church, he was treasurer of the Western Shore, and he was speaker of the Lower House. So he was integral, and he was also very integral into the founding of public schools in Annapolis, starting in 1736. So, though very dynamic in Annapolis civic life, the Hammond family really remained at Howard's Adventure, which was about 15 miles from the city center. So they would go back and forth, but their main principal house was at Howard's Adventure. So Matthias Hammond was very familiar with Annapolis as he came of age in society. He joined an Annapolis gentlemen's club called the Forensic Society in 1764 when he was just 16 years old. So that's pretty early. His early introduction into social life is in line with, his family's wealth. Wealthier people in that society kind of really got immersed into social life at an early age. Now, after the death of his father, Philip, in 1760, Matthias began appearing on more legal records, mostly the witnessing of land sales. He became a shrewd businessman and at a young age, and even sued a landholder from St. Mary's County when he was just 21 years old. He amassed wide land holdings and became very wealthy in his own right. As he looked towards the future, he began to acquire lots in Annapolis with the intention of building a house. Now, contemporaries had really mixed reviews of Matthias. The Carroll family, in particular, of Annapolis, took disdain to his business dealings in land disputes and even gave him a nickname of Fish or Fishy Hammond in their correspondence. It's unclear if the nickname was used just by the Carroll family or others in Annapolis as well. In a 1780 letter from Charles Carroll of Annapolis to his son Charles Carroll of Carrollton, he refers to Matthias Hammond, saying, "I need not suggest the reasons you may offer him to consent, nor recommend such conduct, were he a man of the least honor." Despite the conflict with the Carrolls, Matthias demonstrated his good intentions, as shown by his work with the Well-Meaning Society. In February of 1773, Matthias chose to lease a small portion of his Annapolis lots to the Well-Meaning Society, which was mainly a group of craftsmen. Matthias was influenced by a desire to promote the intention of so worthy a society. Matthias leased them the property for rent for 1 penny current money, which they would pay every March 1st. The lease extended for 99 years, renewable after that, on the condition that the group build a house on the property at their own expense within 3 years. If the group did not meet that deadline, the lease would terminate and it would be sold at auction. And if they decided that they weren't going to meet for a certain period of time for more than 6 months, then it would also be sold at auction. The lot was on Prince George Street next to the Pega House. In August of 1773, the Well-Meaning Society sold back the lease to Matthias Hammond as they couldn't build the house within the time frame specified in the lease. The group was politically minded and really aligned with the Patriot cause and focused on discussions of moral well-being. So Matthias, he was a staunch patriot, and he would have been easily in support of the group. Now, Matthias was very engaged in civic life for a stretch of really only about 4 years, from 1772 to about 1776. It was during that time that he acquired the 4 city lots and hired architect William Buckland to design his grand home in Annapolis. The work began in spring of 1774. His Bryce cousins were meanwhile improving their homes. His cousin James Bryce was building and furnishing an opulent mansion on the corner of East and Prince George Street in downtown Annapolis, which still exists today. This was really Annapolis's golden age, and planter politicians were busy commissioning grand townhouses during this time, like Matthias. During this building boom, more than 14 large residences were constructed. Now, sadly for Matthias, his personal and professional life did not match his material wealth. In April of 1773, he became a vestryman at St. Anne's Church, like his father had done. And in May of that year, he was elected as a representative for Annapolis at the General Assembly at the State House, and he went on to serve on a number of committees. Rising tension with England led to a fission between the once congenial Annapolis neighbors. The Patriots further divided into two groups, and Matthias was aligned with the more extreme section of that. It was partly on his insistence that the infamous Peggy Stewart ship was burned in Annapolis Harbor in October of 1774 after carrying tea from England. Now, Matthias and his brother Reason also were politicians. Reason was also a politician, and both were very vocal in the opposition to British rule and spoke with the militia to advance their ideals. Matthias Hammond was not re-elected, and those with more conservative views on the Patriot side, of course, were chosen to serve, so they weren't going with the more radical faction. After 1776, Matthias Hammond began to retreat from civic life and mainly attended to business fairs on his various properties. He lived with his mother Rachel and bachelor brothers at Howard's Adventure. In April of 1776, when the artist Charles Willson Peale left Annapolis for Philadelphia, he sold Matthias Hammond his sulky, which is a carriage. Now, despite patriotic feelings, Matthias Hammond hired Joseph Roberts as his substitute for military service in May of 1778, which was typical of a gentleman of that period who could afford such a luxury. In the 1783 tax, it showed Matthias Hammond owning 63 slaves, an abundance of livestock, 3,400 acres of rural land, 4 city lots, accumulating to a total wealth of 8,657 pounds. So you could certainly afford a luxury like hiring a substitute. By contrast, you can see for somebody middle class, his architect William Buckland, 1774 inventory, accounted for just 672 pounds of total wealth. So that's a big disparity. It's curious what aversion Matthias had for his land in Annapolis and his house, why he didn't want to live there. A March 1779 letter from Hammond's next-door neighbor, Edward Lloyd, to his brother Richard Bennett Lloyd in England suggests that Hammond is not living in his house. And he says, "I have already mentioned Hammond will neither sell nor rent his house." Perhaps he was disillusioned by his failed politics. We really shall never know. Historians in the 20th century advanced the notion that he was jilted by a fiancée. However, there is no documentary evidence to support this claim, and the narrative was likely developed to make sense of his bachelorhood. As 3 of his 5 brothers never married, and his cousin James Bryce did not marry until his mid-30s, Matthias may have never felt compelled to do so, or he had intentions to take a wife in the future. He was very close to his mother Rachel, who favored him among her other children in her will upon her death in 1786. Matthias Hammond died in November of 1786, so the same year, and he was only 38 years old. He was buried in the family cemetery at Howard's Adventure, along with his parents and siblings. The manor house at Howard's Adventure had 2 stories, and it was a wood frame structure with fieldstone foundation about 6 feet thick. Over time, the house was significantly altered and took on the appearance of an Italianate structure with gables. By the time of the late 19th century, that was when the Italianate structure sort of took place. In addition to the manor house and cemetery, there are large stones on the yard where it was said to be the site of slave auctions. It is unknown how many enslaved individuals were subject to auctions here. However, we know that the Hammond family held a large number of enslaved individuals who contributed to the financial success of the property. In the 18th century, the main crop was tobacco, which required arduous labor. After the death of Matthias, his brother Reason continued to live on the property. Per research conducted by Jim Cheevers, former senior curator at the United States Naval Academy Museum, the property had 9,000 acres at the time of Reason's death in 1809, so he outlived his brother by quite some time. The property was then given to a nephew, Major Philip Hammond, who also for a time owned the Hammond-Harwood House in Annapolis, but never lived there. The estate of Howard's Adventure descended through generations until 1905, when it came into the hands of George A. Kirby, the brother of Major Philip Hammond's granddaughters-in-law, so a family relation but far off. A 1903 newspaper article noted that the fields adjacent to the house still had the original names, including Deer Park, Sheep Field, Charter Oak, and Pump Lot. In 1913, Congress acquired the property and used it as a dairy farm for the United States Naval Academy after a typhoid outbreak at local farms. They needed a clean dairy supply there for milk. In 1922, Laura Webb Peploe, previously mentioned, who was the author of Hammond Family, and she was also a descendant who grew up at Howard's Adventure, described the house. She said, "There is a wonderful charm and picturesqueness. It is a long, low building with high ceiling on the first floor, and it arose to nearly 2 full stories, with dormer windows extending along the front roof. There are also massive chimneys at either end and huge fireplaces, which are now planked up. Built after the English fashion, there is a wide central hall with 2 large, handsome square rooms on either side. The hall and the drawing room are handsomely paneled in oak from the floor to the ceiling. This paneling has been spoiled by many coats of paint. A wide, easy stairway with mahogany rails and newer posts make a good picture." Now, Miss Webb Peploe was an early advocate for the Hammond-Harwood House in Annapolis and a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution. She held meetings of the DAR, Daughters of the American Revolution, in the family cemetery at Howard's Adventure in August of 1941, where she was laid to rest later in 1956, in the last known burial on that site. In the 1920s, the house began to fall into disrepair. The paneling was removed by a relative in Baltimore and installed into his home, where it remains today. In the mid-20th century, the house saw changes when the second story was divided into apartments for workers for the Naval Academy Dairy Farm. The manor saw a brief glimmer of hope when Anne St. Clair Wright, founder of Historic Annapolis, took an interest in the property. In 1957, there was a movement to dispose of the dairy farm. However, some congressmen disagreed and made it so it would take an act of Congress to dispose of the farm. In 1998, it was leased to Anne Arundel County, which still manages the property today. Well, the federal government owns it, and it is still a dairy farm. In 1977, Jim Cheevers, then curator of the United States Naval Academy Museum, was able to get the manor house placed on the National Register for Historic Places. The site was unfortunately a target for local vandals, and the home was set ablaze the following year, and it burned to the ground on October 15, 1978. Thus closes a sad chapter in the saga of the home of Matthias Hammond. All that remains now is a cemetery and large stones where the slave auctions are said to have taken place. Though the house has been lost, some of Matthias Hammond's relatives' homes can still be seen today, such as Burley, built by his brother Reason in 1802, which is an animal sanctuary in Ellicott City, and Acton, started by his father in 1760 and finished by his brother John, which is actually on the market if you have a couple $1 million in Annapolis. Matthias Hammond's own houses, the Hammond-Harwood House and Howard's Inheritance, which is just out, it's sort of in West Annapolis, I've been there, very interesting, are also still standing. And Howard's Inheritance is a private home, by the way. On March 13th, the last day of normal before the onset of COVID-19 restrictions, my good friend and I, Fran Harwood, she's my buddy, she is a Hammond-Harwood House docent, researcher, wonderful person. We took a trip out to Howard's Adventure together. It was a beautiful day, and it really felt like spring as we drove through the rolling fields in modern-day Gambrills, Maryland. As we entered the dairy farm, we edged by the early 20th century buildings created for housing for the workers, which are still utilized. The road out to the cemetery was very bumpy as we reached the site, and we were dismayed to see 3 enormous bulls blocking the ancient burial ground, stomping their hoofs and angrily eyeing the car from behind an electric fence. Fearless Fran wanted to press on, but I surmised that maybe that wouldn't be in our best interest. So we drove up a bit further, and we were able to take pictures and get out. As I surveyed the lush green surroundings, so peaceful, I could understand the comfort this land provided to Matthias Hammond. I was grateful in that moment to be in a beautiful place with one of my good friends, as I knew then that our world was about to change. On our way out, we met one of the farmers who worked in the property. He kindly offered to move the bulls if we were able to schedule a visit in advance next time. So perhaps when the world comes back into a more normal existence, we can once again visit Howard's adventure and be able to better understand the world Matthias Hammond called home. A special thank you for research goes out to Jim Cheevers, Jean Russo, and Fran Harwood for their continued friendship and research. Thank you so much, and I will be back again with more research next time.